All your life, you've been lied to about how to measure value and success, but all of that changes today. In this video, I'm going to discuss the philosophy of an ancient thinker the entire world seems to have forgotten, but which can put you ahead of 99% of people in life. And along the way, I'll draw upon my years of experience as an internationally published researcher in value theory, as well as a successful entrepreneur to do so. In the 600s BC, in ancient Greece, before all of the famous names you've heard of, such as Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, there was an entire class of philosophers who studied what they called physis, which is the root of our modern word physics. They spent much of their time studying the universe, what it was made of, and they asked deep questions about the nature of reality. One of these philosophers was named Thales of Miletus. Whereas philosophers such as Democritus believed the world was made of small particles called atoms, and philosophers such as Pythagoras believed the world was made up of numbers, Thales believed the entire world was made up of water, simply in different states. Now, of course we look back at Thales' ideas here and realize he was totally wrong, but I believe this is not the most important part of Thales' legacy. Instead, the most important part of his story is how he lived his life. You see, one day, Thales' friends came to him and said, "Why do you waste so much time thinking about the nature of the universe? You should focus your energy on more practical things, such as how to get rich. Thinking about the universe won't put food in your stomach." And you see, this made Thales' blood boil. This remark, in fact, frustrated Thales so much that he did something economic historians study to this day as one of the first possible examples of what is called buying a call option in finance. You see, Thales knew that the price of olive oil surged in summertime, and so he knew that at that time, olive oil presses would be in high demand. So during the wintertime, he invested in olive oil presses, buying up as many as he could. When the summer rolled around, he rented those presses, and as expected, he made a fortune and became rich beyond his wildest dreams. At that point, he went back to his friends and told them, "You see, it's not that I can't become rich. I just choose not to focus on getting rich." And so what's the moral of the story here? It clearly can't be that money isn't important, right? After all, if you want to sit and think about the universe all day, you probably have to be at least a little bit financially comfortable. So no, that's not it at all. Instead, what Thales seems to have been arguing here is twofold. One, that the practice of philosophy makes you better equipped than most people to be able to think outside the box for creative solutions, and two, that simply maximizing the amount of money we make is one of the least practical things we could do. Yes, you heard that right. Maximizing the amount of money we make, often seen as the very definition of what is practical, is probably one of the most impractical and even irrational things we could do. But if you ask many mainstream economists, they would probably consider this idea absurd. Yet, a growing body of evidence over the past decade or so has cast a lot of doubt on these traditional economic theories. Consider, for instance, the early modern and medieval peasant farmers of Europe from about the 1400s to the 1800s. Traditional economic theory tells us that as the price of a good increases, a supposedly rational producer will try to sell as much as possible of that good. In other words, they will try to do what economists call maximize expected utility. Yet increasingly, this is not the behavior that researchers actually observe in the field. Instead, in the case of the peasant farmers, these farmers would more often decrease their production as prices for their products rose, even though they theoretically could make even more money by selling more at the new higher price. But why? Because those peasants had what economists and value theorists call a satisficing mindset. In other words, since they now could make more money with the same or even less production, this freed up time and resources for them to do other things they found value in. And I mean, just think about it. If you were offered a job in which you made $1,000 per hour, how many hours would you choose to work? Well, it would depend on a few factors, wouldn't it? It would depend on what your current income is, which would determine what is called the marginal value of that $1,000 per hour, and it would also depend on what value you place on your time. This is key. It's what economists and value theorists call opportunity cost. And so one thing becomes very clear. Your answer to the question of how many hours you would work depends not on some abstract maximizing behavior, but instead on your non-financial values such as family time, leisure time, time spent taking care of your physical and mental health, and what Thales considered most intrinsically valuable, time spent enriching and expanding your mind by learning about the world. In fact, as someone who has pretty much exclusively made my income by running businesses for the past 12 years, I can tell you that a large proportion of business owners and entrepreneurs do not actually seek to maximize profits. Again, I know we've been so brainwashed into believing this myth that it actually sounds weird to hear something like this, but allow me to explain. While many people do start businesses with the mindset of, I want to make as much money as humanly possible and become a multi-billionaire, this is actually less common than you might think. Most entrepreneurs instead have that satisficing mindset we discussed before with respect to the peasant farmer example. What this means is that entrepreneurs often start with one of two goals. One, a vision goal, or two, a lifestyle goal. When an entrepreneur has a vision goal, he or she aims to fulfill some vision, almost in an artistic or creative way. They want to revolutionize something. They want to change the way something works in an industry, and so on. When an entrepreneur has a lifestyle goal, they have in their mind some ideal lifestyle that the business should achieve for them. A life of travel, time spent with family, doing missionary work, whatever. The idea behind both of these goals is that there's a concrete end goal, and each of these has some fixed price tag associated with it. But the price tag required to achieve it is not itself the goal. And once they've achieved that goal, more money isn't really relevant to them, as they've already achieved the intrinsic goal. Of course, when businesses get to a certain size and external investors get involved, as many entrepreneurs will tell you, it ends up destroying the original mission they set out to create. And then, yes, the business becomes all about maximizing profit for the sake of maximizing profit. And is this behavior really rational? In the book, The Alternative, How to Build a Just Economy by Nick Romeo, Romeo does a great job not only of analyzing this question from an evidence-based perspective, but he offers several evidence-based examples of alternative business and economic models that actually work. So I recommend checking it out. In my own book, Rationality, Virtue, and Liberation, I also do an extensive analysis of the concept of value, and in fact demonstrate the exact problems with the idea of expected utility in mainstream economic theory. One point I've made is that if we simply change the expected utility equation just a bit by removing the imaginary concept of utility from the equation and instead modify it to look more like a simple probability equation, it will become a much better method of measuring intrinsic value. But why? Because instead of measuring utility, which once again is something purely imaginary, we can measure the probability of achieving what Aristotle, an admirer of Thales, called Telos, which represents real, tangible outcomes. Okay, so we're modifying some equations here and there. What does that matter? Well, it matters a lot. Because the expected utility equation, although it's not its intention, essentially reduces all value to economic value. But intuitively, you know that's not true. Friendship and family have intrinsic value separate from economic value. Learning and personal growth have intrinsic value, as both Aristotle and Thales would say, as ends in themselves. And art and history seem to have intrinsic value, which is why we spend hundreds of millions of dollars keeping museums open and preserving a bunch of old stuff, all for absolutely no economic return whatsoever. And so, what does this all mean for your own life? Well, as Romeo points out in The Alternative, it's not about some ideological purity. It's about what works and what doesn't. And determining what works is a matter of understanding clearly what you value. Are you actually a value maximizer, as in the traditional economic models? Well, there's no shame in that. Very likely it's because you see creating value as a sort of game. In effect, as a source of excitement and fun. And if you're creating value for other people in the process, then great. But if it's a sort of addiction for you, in the sense that you feel you need to keep accumulating things and wealth just because you need to, then it's time to reevaluate your value system. If this is your pattern of behavior, it's more likely that the things you value aren't what you truly value at all, but are instead, as the philosopher René Girard has pointed out, a form of what is called mimetic desire, or desire you acquire simply because others desire it. And so, in a very real sense, the reduction of all value to economic value is a sort of sickness, but it's a sickness that kind of makes sense. You see, if most of us look back in our family tree, even 2 or 3 generations, we'll likely discover a story of struggle. Sometimes we forget that as little as 50 to 70 years ago, it was pretty normal for people in most countries not to have enough food to eat or shelter or basic living standards. And so if you were lucky enough to get an education, you better work your butt off to make sure you get the best grades possible so you can get the best job possible so you can avoid the same fate and misery as the generation that came before you. So it's easy to see how we can associate value itself with economic value, essentially with mere survival. But life is about more than just survival, and we should strive constantly to make it about more than just survival. For her honors thesis, my sister wrote and presented on the little-known artist and philosopher Jean Dubuffet. When I first encountered his art at that age, I felt like, this stuff is so stupid. I could even create the same thing. It was only in my later years that I finally started to understand what Dubuffet was getting at with his art and philosophy. One must be receptive, he states, to the totally unexpected, the totally useless. You see, from the standpoint of traditional economics and traditional value measurement methods, things like friends, family, art, history, all of these are, in a very real sense, useless. We don't typically get a financial return from a friendship, yet we value friendship as an end in itself. We don't typically get financial return from learning history, yet learning history is valuable in and of itself. And as Thales, one of the great entrepreneur philosophers of the ancient world, rightly pointed out, we've got everything completely backwards. We don't learn philosophy so we can make money. We make money so we can learn philosophy. If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.